Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman. I am a professor at Grove City College, a visiting fellow at the University of Notre Dame, and a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. I am your host. I'm here as always with my friend and co-host, the Reverend Todd Pruitt, who is the pastor of Covenant PCA Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Good to see you, Todd.
Good to see you, Carl.
It is snowing heavily here. I assume it's the same in Virginia. Is that the...
Really? You know, it is not snowing. We're cool and overcast, but you know, you're quite a bit farther north than I am.
We are, and just south of the lake, so it's an interesting experience.
How are things going way up there with our neighbors at Notre Dame? I mean, have they figured you out yet?
I'm enjoying it. I've just started teaching, actually, a class titled The Abolition of Man, starting with C.S. Lewis's book and working through, actually, to Mary Harrington, previous guest on the show. She's given me permission to use one of her lectures as discussion points. So it's great. And I have a class with, I would say, about half of them are Catholics. Yeah. There's an Orthodox believer. There's a few Protestants. There are very few Protestants at Notre Dame, but I've tended to find them all. And a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, would you believe?
Wow.
So it's I'm enjoying a very fruitful and lively engagement with the students here. So really enjoying my
And I would guess that the campus is quite stunning when it's snowing out.
It's
a beautiful place,
beautiful.
Isn't it?
It's a very beautiful campus. So I've had to chain myself to so many railings here because there's so much Catholic imagery around. But other than that, having said that, it's a great pleasure. We actually have a Catholic guest today. He is one of my, I suppose at the moment, I simultaneously have at least three bosses. He's one of my three bosses. He is Ryan Anderson, president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., famous, or perhaps infamous, for having his book, When Harry Became Sally, banned by Amazon, which, by my account, Ryan, makes you worse than Hitler and the Unabomber.
That's why I'm your favorite boss, right?
Yes. So it's great to have such an evil guest with us today. But we are, of course, delighted that Mr. Bezos has brought Ryan back in from the cold, and that you can now get a great book, When Harry Became Sally, from Amazon. But we've asked Ryan to join us today to talk about the importance of religious freedom. A couple of reasons. One, Ryan is a member of the committee that's been put together by the president to talk about the importance of religious freedom in America as she moves into the future. And also, I think probably from the perspective of Todd and myself, the other important aspect of this topic is, we grew up at a time when religious freedom was taken as an obvious unconditional virtue that nobody needed to justify. We've noticed in the last few years that not merely among what we might call radical secular voices, but even among conservative religious voices, serious objections and challenges have been raised to the importance and the value of religious freedom. So, Ryan, it's great to have you with us today, and would want to get into this very important topic with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you. As you guys were bantering about Notre Dame, it brought back memories. I went there for my PhD, so I suffered through many a cold winter with lake effect snow. I remember when I studied I was studying for my comps in political philosophy, and we had like 24 inches of snow within 24 hours the week of the big the big exam. And I was like, this is great. Like, I'm out shoveling my car when I should be like, reading Plato and Aristotle and all the rest. But
Catholic priests founded some great universities, but they could have chosen the locations slightly better, I feel.
Well, if you guys weren't persecuting us at the time, we would have had better real estate. But there's a reason, the Holy Cross Brothers have to go to the middle of nowhere in Indiana.
Indeed. But anyway, Ryan, tell us a little bit to begin with about the the committee that you're involved with, to the extent that you're able, and
sure.
Why this committee at this point in time? What is it that's going on, say, in the Trump administration that has made religious freedom a matter of interest at the highest levels of American executive power?
Sure. I mean, one way of telling this story is that when President Bill Clinton signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act into law, it had passed unanimously in the House of Representatives, in the U.S. Senate, and Clinton, who was, a Democrat, was the president who signed it into law. If I remember correctly, Chuck Schumer was the lead sponsor, not when he was Senator Schumer, but when he was Congressman Schumer. So he was one of the lead sponsors in the House, bipartisan support in the Senate. I think it was even possible that Clinton quipped that, this is the clearest evidence we have that God exists and that he works miracles is that we have the ACU, the American Conservative Union, and the ACLU. We have like the People for the Separation of Church and State, and we have the Catholic bishops all supporting this legislation. And so the reason I start with that is to say, during the late 1990s, religious liberty was a bipartisan, issue as recently as the 1990s. I mean, up until that point as well, it was like this was the first right that's articulated in the Bill of Rights, the first right in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And then sometime, I would say, in the Obama years, religious liberty all of a sudden becomes a partisan issue. It becomes a divisive issue. In the New York Times, it has scare quotes put around it. And the reason why, I think, a couple of things. One was the contraception mandate, when all of a sudden you have the Little Sisters of the Poor, the owners of Hobby Lobby, various Christian organizations being told that they would have to pay for abortion-causing drugs. You realize the Green family, the evangelicals who owned Hobby Lobby, they weren't opposed to contraception as such. They were opposed to I think it was 5 or 6 HHS mandated contraceptives that had FDA labels saying these drugs and devices can cause an abortion, right? And the Green family is Southern Baptist. They're okay with contraception. They're against pills that can kill, right? They're pro-lifers. Little Sisters of the Poor, they're both opposed to abortion and to contraception because they're Catholics. They're little sisters. So the question was, why would the federal government be forcing nuns to violate their beliefs? Why would they be forcing evangelical business owners to violate their beliefs? And then I think we quickly saw, why, they saw what was at stake here was the aftermath of Obergefell. And they saw that the precedent we had for, at that point, 40 some years post Roe said that, the compromise was, women get a right to an abortion, which was never really accepted. We were still going to litigate that, but we weren't going to force pro-lifers to violate their conscience. It was clear here in the run-up to Obergefell was that it's not just a matter of legally redefining what marriage is. We're also going to make the baker bake the cake, the florist arrange the flowers, the website designer design the website, the adoption agency do the same-sex adoptions, even so much as to transgender issues, right? There are Catholic hospitals that had been sued for not doing sex reassignment procedures. It's all that is to say is that I think the culture war made religious liberty all of a sudden something that got put in scare quotes. It made it a partisan issue. And that meant that the Trump administration during their first term had to undo a lot of things that happened during the Obama years. And then Biden brought a lot of those things back. And so the president, had the idea. It was suggested to him by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas. Lieutenant Governor Patrick said, you should create a commission on religious liberty the way that President Clinton and President Bush had commissions on bioethics, right? The big issues in the 90s and the early 2000s, embryo ethics, cloning, reproductive research, experimental research on embryos, things like this. So Dan Patrick is now the chair of the committee. Ben Carson is the vice chair. And then I think it's either 12, maybe it's 13 members total. So it's the two of them plus then 11 additional members. And we've had maybe 4 public hearings so far. I think we have another 4 or 5 scheduled this year. And then our charge is to, produce a report, a series of recommendations to the president in conjunction with the 250th anniversary of the country. So by the 4th of July of this year, we're going to have a report with a whole host of recommendations on what the Trump administration can do to protect religious liberty.
Quick question, Ryan. The makeup of the commission, it's not just Christians, is it? There's also, I think, Jewish representatives, and Sheikh Humza, I believe, is representing Islam.
Yeah, so it's the commission itself has I think it's 4, maybe 5 Catholic members. It's 6 or 7 Protestants, and then Rabbi Meir Soloveichik on the Jewish side. And then there's also, I think, 3 different advisory councils to the commission. And that's where you also have Sheikh Hamza. You saw on the Islamic side, there's several other, if I remember correctly, Muslim advisors, some other Jewish advisors, various both Catholic and Protestant advisors. And then in terms of, expert witnesses who we've had testify, it's gone beyond just those religious traditions that I've mentioned at this most recent hearing, which was down in Texas. If I remember correctly, there was a Sikh who had testified, and a Hindu either this past hearing or 2 hearings ago. So the idea here is that to borrow the language of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty is A to Z, Anglican to Zoroastrian. And so this is not just meant to be about the freedom of the church, which is important. And as Catholics and Protestants on this podcast, like the libertas ecclesia is important, but the freedom of religion goes beyond that. And so we're also concerned. We have a hearing. It's in early February, which will be devoted to anti-Semitism, and there will be a variety of both plaintiffs who have sued the federal government or state and local governments from a variety of faith traditions, and then a variety of topical areas. We've looked at education. We're going to be looking at health care. We're going to be looking at, we just did look at the military, right? And so the idea is to think of where are the different venues in which religious liberty has been violated, and then who are the various people. During one of our education hearings, we had families who were part of the Mahmoud case, where you had Muslim, Christian, and Jewish families who had sued Montgomery County, Maryland, a DC suburb, because of their LGBT curriculum, right? And so what this shows is that, look, this isn't a Christian issue. Here you have Orthodox Jews, Orthodox Christians, and Orthodox Muslims who all reject kind of the indoctrination and, to a certain extent, like an established theology vis-a-vis human sexuality that was being imposed on them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because so much of the discussion about religious liberty in our day has intersected with the whole issue of what it means to be human, the telos of the body, of sexuality, of marriage, of reproduction, those kinds of things. And I remember back when Senator Biden was a full-throated defender of the Hyde Amendment, for instance, which of course changed once it became impossible to be a successful Democrat and be in support of the Hyde Amendment. But it's interesting, again, the intersection of these issues that have been forefront with so many Christian thinkers about, again, the nature of man, the body, the telos of sexuality, et cetera, and the freedom of the conscience. And I suppose that's where the rub is, because if I believe that your doctrine requires you to believe that the unborn are worthy of protection, in fact demand protection, then I've got to move you out of the way. You've got to change your mind on this, or if you won't celebrate, if you won't use your talents to add to the celebration of my gay marriage, you must be punished for this. You can't be tolerated anymore. And so that's kind of, I see that as sort of the ground of what's going on here. And I think 50 years ago, we would have had a hard time conceiving of any of those things being the battleground.
I think that's right, which is why if you look at a prior generation of religious liberty violations, they were much more about like distinctively religious doctrines, whereas today it's much more about anthropology.
Right.
So when you
Right.
you know the question of what it means to be human,
Hmm.
like that's where most of our most contested religious liberty battles, culture war battles, whatever you want to call them, because it's about life. Just yesterday, I was reading a story about a Catholic hospital in Canada that is being sued because they wouldn't do an assisted suicide.
Yeah.
Did you guys see this?
I saw it.
You saw, yeah. So, beginning of life and end of life, we're going to see there are two different understandings of the value of human life. And if you're on the wrong side of that, will you be coerced? The transmission of life. So many of our debates about marriage and sexuality and reproduction, and then just our embodiment as male and female. I mean, like, whether or not you could be sued for not using someone's preferred pronouns, for if you're a doctor. I mean, this was a requirement under Obamacare. The Obama Department of Health and Human Services, Obamacare says no discrimination on basis of sex. In May of 2016, the Obama HHS and DOJ said the word sex now means gender identity. And so if you are a hospital that performs a double mastectomy in the case of breast cancer, you also have to perform a double mastectomy in the case of a woman who wants to identify as a man. Otherwise, you're discriminating on the basis of gender identity, right? And there were no religious liberty exemptions to that regulation. There were no rights of conscience, right? Some doctors, they're not religious. They just think, I have a conscientious objection to this. There was also no consideration for best medical judgment, right? Some doctors think some patients, it's a good idea to transition, but other patients, it's not a good idea. This was now a civil right, right? They were using a civil rights statute to say you have to do this. And so again, it's broader than just religious liberty here, because as I mentioned, the best medical judgment or the rights of conscience, you don't need to be religious to have those set of concerns. But many of the religious liberty battles directly kind of intersect with this new vision of what it means to be human.
Because Christian theology demands those connections be made. Carl, you make that point in your as yet to be released book, that these considerations, these anthropological considerations, are, from a Christian standpoint, necessarily tied to what we believe about God and about creation.
Yeah,
they can't ultimately be abstracted from that.
Yeah, but it comes down to what you think it means to be a human being, and as most religions in the world have a strong opinion on that, then challenges to the received wisdom on what it means to be human are also challenges to those religions, and we see it particularly in. As Ryan has pointed to, beginning of life and end of life issues, in which context, actually, I would recommend listeners, if you haven't seen the book, What It Means to Be Human, by Carter Snead, who's a professor at Notre Dame Law School. His book is really one long argument that, when we mess around with what it means to be a human being, the most vulnerable, i.e., those at the start of life and those at the end of life, become the victims. And also, without wanting to puff critical theory here, I would say, it's interesting that what we see on this front is kind of the sort of thing that the critical theorists could have predicted, and that one of their big mantras is, everything turns into its opposite. The language of freedom actually becomes slavery. When you think, I was saying yesterday in class, when you think about the way that assisted suicide has been presented as liberating, what it actually ends up doing is meaning that old, vulnerable people without agency, end up getting pressured into taking their own lives. So the anthropological crisis.
Yeah, depressed people.
Yeah.
And we just saw another case this past week of a young man who was depressed.
Yeah.
And he was put down.
Yeah. And even somebody like Richard Dawkins is sort of ham-fistedly acknowledging now that these kind of questions have religious significance, and that's what makes the work on of Ryan's commission so important. Ryan, why do you think it is that in Christian circles, and I know that Catholicism has had analogous impulses to conservative Protestantism on this front. Some of our colleagues are beginning to think, religious colleagues are beginning to think that religious freedom is a bad thing.
So, two thoughts there, and one is like a healthy concern, and the other I think is a less healthy concern. One is that for a lot of people, both religious leaders and political leaders, they started talking about religious liberty instead of talking about the underlying truth claims. And so I had written an essay, I want to say it was, I don't know, 8 years ago now, titled something like Proxy Wars on Religious Liberty. And what I was arguing was that we're actually fighting a proxy war when we're using religious liberty, but what we're really disagreeing about is human nature and about the morality of our competing views of human nature and what, our understanding of the human person and human dignity requires of us when it comes to the beginning of life, the end of life, the transmission of life, marriage and the family, our embodiment as male and female. And there were some religious leaders and some political leaders who preferred to just talk about the religious liberty side of this as a way of sidestepping the substantive issue. And, obviously, having written books on the marriage debate and the transgender debate and the abortion debate, I also wrote books on the religious liberty debate, but I wasn't trying to sidestep. I think we had to do both and. We both had to defend the truth about marriage and about life and about our embodiment and defend the freedom to both to live in accordance with the truth and to disagree, right? I mean, there are people who disagree who still have religious liberty claims, and I mean, I think it's one thing for the politicians to do this, and they're largely doing it because they don't want to have to defend something controversial in the public square. It's another thing when religious leaders were talking only about religious liberty and not actually catechizing and preaching and teaching their flock about the truth of the matter. All right, so that's one, and I think it's okay. It's healthy for people like the three of us to say, wait, it can't just be religious liberty. Religious liberty is important, but it's not enough. I'm pretty sure I wrote an essay by that title as well. All right, but so that's the kind of like healthy reservation that I think some people have had to religious liberty. The unhealthy reservation is that, well, religious liberty is really only for me or for my tribe. Religious liberty is only for Protestants, or it's only for Christians, or it's only for Jews and Christians, or it's, you can fill in the blanks. Whereas I think a better understanding is that it's precisely because of Christian beliefs that we are made in the image and likeness of God that religious liberty is for everyone. I can remember I used to work for Father Richard John Newhouse before he had passed away, and he said, it's God's will that we not fight with each other or not kill each other over our disagreements about God's will. And so he was, that was his shorthand for a theological argument, saying like God doesn't want coerced religion. And God wants all of us to freely respond to the gospel. And that means we also have to be able to freely reject the gospel, right?
And there's a good conservative case. Yeah, there's a good conservative case to be made for religious liberty in terms of, the Christian faith is not coerced. It can't be coerced. And what would be, in your mind, the legitimate limits of Christian liberty?
Yeah, and so this is where I think the people who they're both good and bad actors on the religious liberty should only be for my tribe. I think the bad actors just don't actually believe in religious liberty. I think the good actors, what they're concerned about is, well, wait, all of our liberties have to have limits. And, I think religious liberty is a natural right, and I think natural rights have natural limits governed by the natural law. I think religious liberty is also a theological principle that would have limits based upon the theology of religious liberty. The way that we've operationalized it in American law, so take the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that I mentioned earlier, it says, if I'm the religious liberty victim, I have to show that I had a sincere religious belief that the government substantially burdened. The government then has to say, well, wait, I did it for a compelling government purpose in the least restrictive way possible. So let's say I'm a sincere Aztec. I'm really sincere about it. And you are putting me in jail for life because I engaged in human sacrifice.
Right.
It's a sincere belief. Life in prison is a substantial burden. The government then says, but look, protecting innocent human life is a compelling government interest. And the least restrictive way of doing this is saying no human sacrifice. It's not like pollution, where too much pollution is a bad thing. And so we can grandfather historic cars, and we might be able to, like, vehicular safety. We can put the red triangles on the back of the Amish's horse and buggy. Right. So not everyone needs electric headlights and taillights. Like, there's a way that we can achieve vehicular safety while also accommodating the Amish. There's nothing like that when it comes to mutilating the body of a child or killing an unborn baby, right? And so that's why when you hear people say, "Oh, I have a religious liberty. I'm a member of," it's a Satanist group who has sued one of the states under their pro-life law, saying, "I have a religious." One, Satanism isn't a religion, and so we should be clear about that. But two, even if it were a religion, government has a compelling state interest in protecting the innocent human life of the baby. And the least restrictive way of accomplishing that interest is there's no human sacrifice, including sacrifice of the unborn. So anyway, I mean, I think that is a helpful legal way of thinking about it. The philosophical and theological is that, look, justice and the common good, public order need to be maintained. And you want to have as much religious liberty as possible, consistent with justice and the common good and public order. And you then have to take each case on a case-by-case basis, and there are going to be limits.
Yeah. And this leads to lots of great questions about what Christians are going to have to struggle through with having Muslim neighbors, and is a community ever justified in saying, hey, listen, we don't want a giant Hindu temple in our community, which are real questions that certain communities are having to deal with right now. And those are challenges because, again, conservative Christians who really have a high value for freedom of conscience also understand, as you've said before, there are certain limits. What that looks like is going to be some should be easy calls. Human sacrifice, beginning in the womb, for instance. Others might get a little bit more complicated. But the fact that there are limits is something that we ought to be able to establish just as surely as we can establish the importance of freedom of conscience. And so, well, this is a conversation. Obviously, it's one of those conversations that could go on and on because it's important. I've never seen the issue of religious liberty in my lifetime be more at the forefront as it should be right now. I've never seen it pressed so much. And as you said before, Ryan, it was really during the Obama administration that we saw the direct attack on religious liberty and the freedom of conscience. And so this is important work. I would just remind our listeners that Ryan Anderson, our guest today, is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. The EPPC does great work. Our own Carl Truman is a fellow there. I would encourage you all, when you get a chance, to go to the Ethics and Public Policy Center's website. They have a wealth of great information, articles, things that will help you think through the intersection of public policy and those categories that, as Christians, we would look at and say that, these are the good and true and right things. And so would encourage you to do that. And, when you get a chance, read one of Ryan's books. Ryan has been a guest with us before. We had Ryan on once to talk about his book that he co-authored with Alexandra Desanctis, who's also been a guest on Mortification of Spin. It's called Tearing Us Apart: How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. To this day, that may be what I think is the most helpful book I've read on the issue of abortion.
Thank you.
I highly recommend it. And if you want to get a copy of that book for free, we'll give away a few on our website. So just go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, and enter to win a copy of this really excellent book, Tearing Us Apart: And you'll see that the authors write in a very kind way, a gentle way, but very clear. It is not a bombastic book, but it is a very clear book on the moral and religious, spiritual, Christian issues at stake on the whole issue of abortion. So go to our website, enter to win a copy of that book. And if you're there and you want to make a donation to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do so as well. I want to thank our guest again, Ryan Anderson, and thank our listeners for being with us today. And we will talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.